Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling one of the biggest questions in all of philosophy. Is our universe the product of some kind of intelligence, or is it all just one big cosmic accident? We're going to dig into the classic design argument.
So it all starts with something you've probably noticed yourself, maybe just looking up at the sky or at a flower. The world seems full of intricate, purposeful stuff. A bird's wing is perfectly shaped for flight. The human eye is this incredibly complex thing for seeing. Even the planets move in these regular, predictable orbits. So the big question is, how did it get that way? And that observation right there is the foundation for a really powerful idea called the design argument. Basically, the idea is that this order we see isn't just a coincidence. No, it's actual evidence that the parts of our universe are so perfectly suited for what they do that they must have been put together by an intelligent designer. Okay, so let's get into the most famous version of this whole idea, which comes to us from a philosopher named William Paley. He came up with this simple, but honestly kind of brilliant thought experiment to make his point. Paley asks us to imagine this. You're walking through a field, and you look down and see a watch, just lying on the ground. Now, you wouldn't think it just grew there, right, like a rock or a plant? Of course not. You'd pick it up, you'd see all the tiny gears and springs all working together for one single purpose, to tell you the time. And you would immediately think, someone, a watchmaker, must have made this. It's just an inescapable conclusion. So his logic, it's super clear, and he calls it an inference to the best explanation. It's a really simple four-step move. 1. You find something complex with parts that are clearly arranged for a purpose, like a watch. 2. You infer that it had to have a designer, a watchmaker. 3. You then look at nature, at something like the human eye, and you see that same kind of complexity for a purpose. So, step 4, you have to conclude that nature must have a designer too. For Paley, this is the main point. When you see something with contrivance or design, complex parts working together, that property demands an explanation. You can't just ignore it. And he argued it makes no difference whether you find that property in a machine like a watch or in a living thing. The best explanation is still a designer.
But of course, not everyone was buying it. In fact, way before Paley even wrote his book, this brilliant skeptic, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, had already come up with a whole bunch of really powerful attacks on the entire idea. And Hume didn't just have one little problem with it, he had a whole arsenal of objections. He said the core analogy was weak, that the world is way too messy and imperfect, and that you just can't make these huge logical leaps based on our super limited experience. So first up, Hume goes right for the throat of the argument, the analogy itself. He says, look, comparing a watch to the entire universe, that's a huge stretch. The difference is just, as he puts it, so striking. We've all seen humans make watches, but who has ever seen a universe being made? To pretend they have a similar cause is, at best, just a wild guess. And then Hume throws out this really fascinating idea. What if order doesn't need a designer at all? He brought up something called the Epicurean hypothesis. The idea is that if you just have atoms bouncing around randomly for an infinite amount of time, they're eventually going to fall into every possible combination, including, just by pure chance, an orderly one like the universe we see today. And this leads to another one of his knockout punches. Hume looks around and sees all the flaws in nature, what he calls dysteleology, or poor design. Think about it. An ostrich has wings but can't fly, or the human appendix, which pretty much just exists to get infected. Hume's point is, if the world is our only piece of evidence, then all its flaws and all its suffering have to tell us something about the Creator. A messy, imperfect world, he argued, might point to a messy, imperfect, maybe even an incompetent designer. So you've got this amazing back and forth between Paley's strong intuition and Hume's sharp skepticism. But there was this huge piece of the puzzle that neither of them could see, something that was going to completely change the game. And that missing piece showed up decades later. You can see it on the timeline here. Hume published his critique in 1779. Paley published his watch argument in 1802. But it wasn't until 1859 that Charles Darwin came along, and really, neither of the other two could have ever predicted the impact he was about to have. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was an absolute game changer. For the very first time, science had a real step-by-step process to explain how the appearance of design could show up in living things without any designer at all. It showed how over millions of years, tiny random changes and the simple pressure of survival could build something as complex as an eye all by itself. So you'd think that was the end of it, right? Evolution comes along and the design argument is toast. Well, not quite. The argument just evolved. It came back in a totally new and, you could say, even more fundamental form, shifting its focus from biology all the way down to physics. So the argument kinda got a reboot. Thinkers like philosopher Richard Swinburne changed the focus entirely. The old school argument on the left was all about biological parts, like the eye. But the modern argument on the right is about something much deeper, the fundamental laws of nature. The question isn't why does this animal have eyes anymore? It's why are there stable, predictable laws of physics in the first place? Swinburne basically argues that the really big mystery isn't why animals are the way they are, but why the laws of physics and chemistry work with such perfect, beautiful regularity. He says that if we're going to explain that regularity at all, if we don't just want to leave it as a mystery, a brute fact, then the only real explanation is that it's the product of a rational choice by a free agent. This totally reframes the whole debate, doesn't it? It moves the argument away from living things and puts it right at the foundation of the entire cosmos. It gives us a pretty stark choice. Either the elegant, orderly laws that run the universe have no explanation at all, they just are, or they're the product of intelligence. And so, here we are, right back where we started, staring at this incredible puzzle of order in the universe. The design argument, in its modern form, leaves us all with a pretty provocative question to chew on. Is the stunningly consistent order of our universe just a brute fact, or does it actually point to something more? As you can see, this is one debate that is far from over.